Months after celebrating her platinum jubilee, the woman who was not born to be queen died after 70 years on the throne, ending one of the most successful reigns of the monarchy. The Queen is dead, long live the King. Within hours of the death of Britain's longest-serving monarchs, a new king ascended the throne. The death of Queen Elizabeth II, while mourned by millions around the UK and indeed the world, also demonstrated how easily the crown passes from one head to the other. Tonight our topic is the monarchy. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. We'll see you on the other side this spring.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
The Queen knelt at the faldstool at her chair of estate to offer private prayer. Upon the high altar had been placed the coronation regalia, whose central piece is the crown of St. Edward, placed upon the head of the sovereign at the actual ceremony of crowning. With becoming dignity, the Queen walked from the chair of estate to a place near King Edward's chair, preparatory to the ceremony of recognition, the presentation witnessed by the Queen Mother, standing between Princess Margaret and the Princess Royal.
I here present unto you Queen Elizabeth, your undoubted Queen. Wherefore all you who are come this day to do your homage and service, are you willing to do the same?
Her Majesty returned to the chair of estate to take the coronation oath, at which the sovereign undertakes to govern according to the respective laws and customs of all peoples under the crown.
Madam, is your Majesty willing to take the oath?
I am willing.
Scenes from the coronation of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on June 2nd, 1953, said to be the most royal in living memory. Our guest tonight is the British High Commissioner, His Excellency Thomas Hartley. Welcome to On the Record, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And welcome to the Bahamas. I know that you have not been here very long. You probably arrived at one of the busiest times in history, particularly for your country.
Absolutely. So I've been here 6 weeks now, and the first month of any new High Commissioner is always busy trying to meet people, but the 10-day period of mourning obviously fell in there as well. It's a bit of it was a time in all our careers and all our lives that we all knew was inevitable, but we all hoped would never come. The fact that it happened in just as I arrived, it created was a real, I suppose, a real privilege for me to be in the Bahamas to see how Her Majesty was remembered and see how that she was respected all over the world. And I've learned an awful lot in my first 6 weeks.
I was about to ask, you know, I'm sure you had to learn some things very quickly and pivot very quickly.
No, absolutely. So normally when one arrives in a country, you present your credential papers, and as the Bahamas and the UK both share the same monarch, my papers get presented to the Prime Minister rather than to the Governor General. And I got a phone call on the Thursday morning from the Prime Minister's office saying the designate High Commissioner should come in now. And we went in and I spoke to the Prime Minister, presented my papers, and we spoke. And news of Her Majesty being unwell was on the news at that time, and we both wished Her Majesty good health. But within an hour of leaving, the news had broken that Her Majesty had died, and it really took me by surprise. As I said, we all kind of knew this moment was coming, but I was in the car at the time and I had to pull over. It was a real sense of I felt lost in a way that I'd not felt before.
There was an outpouring of grief from around the world. I mean, it seemed like the world stopped in that moment when it was announced. But how did that immediately, I guess, affect your work here? Obviously, this is not something that is on your agenda when you come, when you take office.
Exactly that. So when I arrived, I had priorities. I wanted to talk about trade and job creation. I wanted to talk about education and scholarships. I wanted to talk about sport and the arts. And it was beginning to think about how to do that and getting to know people and beginning to introduce myself. And then obviously the period of mourning starts and all those priorities go to one side. As you said, the world stopped. I think, what was the stats from the state funeral? 5 million people watched the state funeral. My role in that moment changed significantly. It's obviously the Governor General and the Prime Minister's office that led the period of mourning. But as the British High Commissioner, there were many Brits here who also wanted to take part in that period of mourning, and my job was to support them and to support the government every way I could. As a country, as the Bahamas, the period of mourning started, the condolence books opened, and the proclamation was read in Parliament Square on the Sunday. And as a High Commission, we opened a secondary condolence book for Brits. But also our job was to make sure then that the Governor General and the Prime Minister could be in London in time for the state funeral as well. And being the Prime Minister of one of His Majesty's realms, the Prime Minister Davis had many other things he had to do in London as well. He had to have a meeting with the King. There were different receptions and opportunities that he had to take, including going to the committal after the funeral. So it was a busy time for the government of the Bahamas, and it was a busy time, therefore, for the High Commission to make sure that all that protocol worked well.
One of the things that I found fascinating, even as I was speaking to people in London, that there is an established protocol from the moment it is announced that a monarch has passed, and that is almost updated on an annual basis.
So I think it's become commonly known as London Bridge, is the operation. And there was a second operation as well called Operation Unicorn, which was if Her Majesty died in Scotland, where the national animal is a unicorn. There was an additional layer of a plan. And that let officials and governors general around the world know what to do in what order. Now, what's amazing about that plan, London Bridge, is Her Majesty herself owns that plan. It was her that signed it off. It was her that made decisions. It was her that brought to bear 70 years of diplomacy and of networking in order to decide how best to run her own state funeral. And from monarch to have committed herself to public service right to the very last minute. In fact, beyond the last minute and the 10 days after, I think it was a huge privilege to kind of be part of that and to see that Her Majesty cared about all those details even after she'd gone. 70
years is a long time for life, but for 70 years for one to be in office as Queen, what does it really say about how she was seen around the world, and what those 70 years meant in that realm. You know, what kind of monarch was she?
I think we are all realizing very quickly that we've had the privilege of living in an era, in the Elizabethan era, where she has been one of the great statesmen in all-time history. I don't think there are many people whom we could credit with such service, public service, as Her Majesty. I also think that where you see what she inherited as the empire and also the world, to where she's brought us to, the transformation that she has led personally, but also that she has lived in. 15 prime ministers, presidents, officials from around the world, countries that that she saw and she enabled to become independent and to become sovereign, and then join the Commonwealth as sovereign equals to the United Kingdom. What an incredible 70 years! As in, if we try to draw two opposing worlds from the 1950s to the 2020s, you probably could have not drawn anything more contrasting. You know, the internet, cars, world travel, the pace of the news. All of these things have changed so much, and Her Majesty has served us throughout that time.
Do you think some of that is lost, though? Because there's always this discussion in the former colonies about, you know, the movement to independence and sovereignty and even still being a part of the Commonwealth. But do you think that is lost sometimes? People don't realize how seamless it was for countries like the Bahamas to move into independence with the blessing and never any hindrance from the monarchy or from Britain at the time.
I think that is certainly that's been the historical fact that the vast majority of countries that have become sovereign during Her Majesty's reign have done so peacefully and calmly. And King Charles made the speech this summer where he talked about the benefit of his long life is that he's seen it happen calmly and without rancor, I think was the expression he used. And even Barbados last year. It was. I don't think it's forgotten. I don't think it's lost. But I think in the world we're in, we're very quickly to move on, and we're very materialistic in both how we handle our life, but also how we handle history. Very short-termist. And but I think what Her Majesty's death has given us opportunities to reflect on some of those things, and the fact that that so many countries became sovereign in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So many of them have gone on to become republics, and yet that all of them still have a positive and forward-looking partnership with the monarchy and with the United Kingdom. I think that's not by chance. And I think when we get to write the history of the Elizabethan era, I think that will be the first paragraph, absolutely.
So we have focused, I think, a little bit on how the world has seen Queen Elizabeth and the outpouring, but in Britain, in London specifically, people lined up for as long as 14 hours for an opportunity to walk past the coffin draped in a flag. You know, I tell people in the Bahamas we like open caskets when we go to see, you know, pay our respects. But people stood 14 hours for just a moment to stand in a room with a coffin draped in a flag. What does that say about how she is and was loved by the people of your country?
I think it speaks volumes, and the fact it wasn't just English people in London and Scottish people in Scotland, in Edinburgh, who wanted to see the casket. It was people of every tribe and colour from around the world who queued up, whether they were celebrity or whether they were foreign or whether they were British or a Londoner. They stood in the queue and they were wanting to sacrifice their own time in order to for those few minutes just to give respect to Her Majesty. I think if there was one wrinkle in that Operation London Bridge that was written, I think that it was too modest in assessing how many people would actually want to show up. And I think that in hindsight, the fact that so many people wanted to come and so many people had seen Her Majesty as a part of their family and a part of their own history, and therefore felt the only thing they could do was come and pay respect. I think is very powerful. My mum is in just north of London. My mum was disabled, and she was so torn about wanting to go and queue up for so long and wanting to pay her respects, but physically not being able to. And actually, there was an accessibility queue that she could have joined, but we didn't realise that till too late. But everyone, however their body, however their health, however their age, stood in that queue. And actually, it was one of the sadnesses of being a High Commissioner overseas is I didn't have the opportunity to do the same. I know you were in London, and I'm loving hearing stories already, and you must actually use this opportunity to tell us a few more. But I think the fact that it was so rich in respect, and when people sat quietly or in the queue, or people stood quietly as the procession walked by after the funeral, and shouts of God save the King, or a quiet prayer to oneself. I think there's not many moments of history we're going to witness like that again.
I have never seen so many people so orderly in my entire life. Yeah. Every queue, every tube station, every line, every lineup for the procession, people just stood in reverence almost, and just waited patiently for however long it took.
I think. Having witnessed that from here, as in London's not always like that. I know you'll have travelled to London.
Oh no,
Londoners have sharp elbows,
yes.
and the tube is never easy to ride on, and when it's busy, and the streets are fast paced. And I think what that was in that moment for those 10 days of mourning is Her Majesty's humility in our public service called us all to something greater. Mm-hmm. And my friends who went into London at that time. It was almost this gentlemanly, after you, sir, or after you, Matt, and it was this reminder that Her Majesty had done exactly the same for 70 years, and had always put herself second in order to put everyone else first, with the greatest privilege on the mightiest throne probably in history. She still chose public service over everything else, and I think that's what you saw in London, is that people were recognising that and people wanting to respect that and to live up to that.
High Commissioner, this is a good place for us to take a break in the show. Stay with us. We're going to be back with more on the record right after this.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
It's a very special moment. It's very sad. We really feel the loss of the Queen. We wanted to be here really to pay our respect, so we went over to Green Park to lay some flowers earlier today, and we wanted the children to be part of it and to really understand the big moment in history.
Just some of the thousands and thousands of individuals who came to show their respect for the Queen. Welcome back to On the Record. We're talking about the monarchy tonight with our guest, His Excellency Thomas Hartley, the British High Commissioner to the Bahamas. Everywhere you went within the City of London, people were either queued up to lay flowers or pay their respects in some way, and it was an outpouring that never seemed to stop for that period of time.
Yeah, and not just in London, but all over the world. The British High Commissions and embassies around the world opened up to allow people to sign the condolence books. And I'm on a WhatsApp group with some of the other heads of mission, some of the other ambassadors, and sharing pictures. And incredible. In Rome, in Hong Kong, in Delhi, in the Bahamas, people wanted to have a physical place they could go to, where they could sign or see or pray or donate something, and there's something probably all quite human in us where we need to be connected in those moments. Mm-hmm. And listening to that clip of that mother saying she wanted her children to be involved, it was exactly the same for me and my family. And my children are all old enough to understand, but young enough where these are quite big experiences. The equivalent of me probably in my childhood was the Berlin Wall coming down and my dad wanting to tell me that about it, or the World Cup '94. And it's these kind of big first moments, and for my children it was the same. And trying to explain, but also their questions of, will the coins change? Will the telephone boxes change? What does it mean for this and what does it mean for that, Daddy? Does this mean your job has ended? And all these different questions, which are really, humble questions from children, and parents bringing them into this experience that us as adults have never had ourselves, because Her Majesty's been on the throne so long.
It has raised a very good point as we now move, to another segment of the discussion. But there are so many things that bear the Queen's image and title, which must now change.
Absolutely, I think Her Majesty's dockyards in the UK are now His Majesty's dockyards. Her Majesty's ambassadors are now His Majesty's ambassadors. Queen's Counsel are now King's Counsel. I think the Bank of England announced yesterday that the new banknotes that will bear His Majesty's head on, or face on, will start to come into circulation soon as well. And these are all things that are just part of everyday life, stamps on letters, and yet they will. The way our global system works is that they have to be backed by something. And for so much of the Bahamas and so much of the UK and so much of Australia and Canada, where we all had Her Majesty as our monarch, so much of what we did was backed by the fact that she was the monarch. Mm-hmm. It was her name and it was her face that therefore gave it intrinsic value. And I think I'm learning so much. I know we've talked about this before. I'm learning so much right now about how the global system has worked, and so many of these things are changing.
I'll tell you, as I was leaving, I held on to some of my pounds, and I thought, these are going to change, and these will probably be the last notes with the Queen's image on it. How much of an adjustment, or I guess. Yeah, how much of an adjustment is that going to be? I mean, we're so used to saying Her Majesty. Here in the Bahamas, we have the Queen's Highway. We're just used to it, all of our lives. This is what we know. She is what we know. It's all Her Majesty. It's the Queen. But now, in a matter of hours, that all changed.
It did. Actually, it did and it didn't. In that, for us, within hours, our flags were down and our black armbands were on, and we were all carrying a sense of grief, as if we'd lost one of our own family, and in many ways we had. But equally, for the sovereign's flag, didn't come down, because the moment that the Queen died, we all said, "God save the King." And the monarchy, which has gone through this dozens of times over hundreds of years, many of these things continue, and the fact that we're not rushing into the crowning ceremony for the King, as in like Her Majesty, I imagine it will be in a year's time, and like the Bank of England haven't said, okay, all these coins have to be returned today. It will just be phased in calmly, and it will just be, yes, Her Majesty has died, but more importantly, the public service overseen by the royal family, but institutionalised in so many things. Those things continue.
How important is that continuity of the monarchy? I think people focused on Her Majesty, they focused on the Queen and the loss, but the institution itself has continued. And how important is that continuity to stability?
I think it's really important, and I think we shouldn't take it for granted. Again, Her Majesty, I'm sure, had a very deliberate plan in her mind about how she would ensure that Prince Charles and with Prince William and Prince George and others would be visible and would grow into the role, and that the moment that she was no longer with us, that there would not be a surprise, the whole thing was planned right from the beginning. And I'm not sure what you thought, but I thought when King Charles gave his first address, I think it was the day or the day after, the day after perhaps, he gave his first address. All of a sudden, I've met Prince Charles. Like he did a state visit when I was a royal visit when I was in Ghana. I spent a lot of time with him. But in that 10 minutes of the speech, I felt like he looked kingly. And it
was almost a physical transformation.
It absolutely was a physical transformation.
I got the exact same. I thought the exact same thing. The prince has now become a king.
Absolutely, and I don't think that was a chance. I think the fact that he himself has served for so long, and he himself has learned so much from Her Majesty, that moment, I'm sure he was holding inside his heart so much personal sorrow, and perhaps didn't know what was coming. But the fact he took it in his stride and was willing to lead us and provide that continuity that you say in that moment, I think that was decades in the making. And I think that is one thing that the monarchy, one of many things that the monarchy has given us as a huge advantage for the Bahamas and the UK, is there's not an election every 5 years. There's not a surprise. There's not a shift. It is, as in, you and I will perhaps never meet King Charles when he's king, but we all live in countries where he sets the tone and Her Majesty sets the tone. And the fact that there's not an election and the fact there is this continuity, it gives us a stability and gives us a platform from which everything else that perhaps is ultimately more important, the government, taxes, war, natural disasters, all of these things take place. But it's the for both our countries, it is the royal family that set the playing field.
Do you think he will need that period of familiarity with the Commonwealth and with UK residents, or do you think it's natural? And the reason I ask is because if you look at any images or film of the independence of the Bahamas, there is the prince.
Yeah.
And we now have the distinction of having a king who would have been a part of our independence celebrations. But do you think there's going to be a long period of familiarity, or you think it's going to happen very quickly? And what do you think may be some of the challenges within that period?
I think actually the adjustment will probably come on our part rather than the royal family's part, where I keep referring to the Prince of Wales, and in my head I mean King Charles, but obviously now Prince William is the Prince of Wales. I live in Cornwall in the southeast of England, which has the Duchy of Cornwall, which for my whole life, Prince Charles, as he was the head of the duchy, and now immediately that's been passed over to Prince William. As you say, we're familiar with Prince William's visit earlier this year to the Duke of Cambridge and Prince Charles's visits over the years, and I think we all take time to adjust to that, absolutely, as citizens of their realms. But equally, again, it has been planned for a long time. So the fact that the Commonwealth, which is the 56 countries of sovereign nations with equal vote, many of whom have had an historic role with the British monarchy, but many of whom haven't, and many of whom have their own monarchies, in fact. But the Commonwealth sits as 56 equal countries. They had already agreed this summer that Prince Charles was the new head of the Commonwealth. So many of these things were done in advance.
Because he spoke at Chogum this year.
Yeah.
As the Queen was not able to attend. Okay, we've got to take a break. We're out of time. But stay with us. We're going to be back with more on our discussion with the British High Commissioner right after this. So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
A symbol from around the world, the British flag at half-mast in respect of the Queen as the world mourned the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Her death immediately indicating that a new king would step into the role. As we went into the break, we started talking a little bit about the new king and his role. A signal to the world, I think, came over the summer at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Rwanda when then Prince Charles spoke. He addressed the Commonwealth on behalf of the Queen. And I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, this is really the beginning of a new era for the monarchy, but also for the Commonwealth, as we now have a new head of the Commonwealth, in which we spoke to, was voted on unanimously by the countries within that grouping.
Yeah, I think the fact that the Commonwealth is a group of sovereign nations with an equal voice and an equal vote, and that they chose King Charles to be the future head of the Commonwealth is an incredibly important moment. We were reflecting that, what Her Majesty inherited when she became Queen was the empire of a group of nations which were not sovereign and which were subjects, and what she enabled, or if not insisted or encouraged, was sovereignty within those places. And many of those countries all those countries then joined the Commonwealth. But the other countries in the Commonwealth, not necessarily, but the fact that are not necessarily related to Britain in that historic way. But the fact that they are sovereign, and then the fact that the next evolution is then they had a choice about who their head would be. We see what Her Majesty has brought from what she had no choice but to inherit, but what she wanted to pass on as inheritance to the next generation. I think that has been hugely powerful. I think King Charles's speech, I know you were there, King Charles's speech this summer in Rwanda was historic for many reasons. One was that it was the first time the Commonwealth choosing their future head. The second is what he said about countries which may want to change their relationship with the British monarchy going forward, and he said that he thought those debates could happen calmly and without rancour, but it was for the citizens of those countries to decide for themselves. I thought was an historic statement. And then also his recognition about the very negative historic role of the British Empire and of not just the British Empire, but of a whole era which including transatlantic slavery, and in his words saying, this is a debate whose time has come. This is a conversation whose time has come.
That took a lot of courage. It must have taken a lot of courage, knowing how many within the Commonwealth feel, and the disdain they have, and the dislike they have for the monarchy because of that. Yeah,
I think so much as what we documented even in the last 10 years is historic fact about what's happened. I was in Ghana during the 400th anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade. And you and your viewers will know how the role of the UK and many other European nations in what was Gold Coast at the time, and therefore the weight of history on Ghana was very important. But when Prince Charles came in 2018, in fact, so to go back a step, so when Prince William was here this year, he made a statement about the slavery being an indelible stain on our
I was
our
going
history.
to mention that, but as you were speaking, it was like this was brought up again during the Prince's visit.
So Prince William brought it up. Prince Charles made the same statement in Barbados last year, but the first time he made that statement was in Ghana in 2018. And I was part of that visit. I'd been in Ghana 2 weeks when I was told that we were going to have a royal visit, and we made plans with much haste. And one of the things that was so important for us and our team and for the royal household was the visit to Osu Castle, which was the historic seat of British rule, and then the historic seat also Ghanaian rule since independence. And in the lower levels of Osu Castle had been where Dutch originally and then Brits had kept enslaved Africans, and there's something called the Door of No Return where so many of them pass through. And His Royal Highness Prince Charles talked about how he wanted to pass through that door of no return himself, but also to return through it, and like many others, sort of break that part of history. But then within his speech in Accra 2 days later, he chose to make this paragraph on the UK's historic role in transatlantic slavery. He chose to bring this up and forward, that was where he first talked about this being an indelible stain on our history, and we must all ensure it must never happen again. I think earlier this year in Chogum he used expressions of it being the values perhaps of the time, or lesser values of the time. But nonetheless, it is something that we must all reflect on and all grow from and all grow forward in. And there is so much that has been documented about what was abhorrent about that time, and perhaps no one more than the Caribbean nations understand that. And in fact, it was one of the British Caribbean team in my High Commission in Ghana, which was the one speaking most often to Prince Charles's household about this speech and the importance of the speech and the importance to the British Caribbean community about hearing something on this. And as it was, Prince Charles himself had already written this into the speech, and it was already going to be made a statement. But I feel like we're living this bit of history where we are acknowledging difficult parts, which should never have happened, and that we will. And what King Charles has allowed in his speech this summer is what he has. What he has said is that this conversation needs to happen, and the permission for all of us to kind of engage in it will be healing, I hope.
I'm hoping the same thing, because in order to even begin a discussion, there has to be an acknowledgement of what happened, and I think that's an important step. One of the hallmarks, I think, also of his time and his role as the prince is he has been really very outspoken about climate change as well. Do you see that continuing to be one of the issues that he pushes forward as king, even within the Commonwealth? I mean, and there are many countries like ours in the Commonwealth who really are so very vulnerable to climate change.
Well, there are many climate change leaders in the world, whether it be David Attenborough or whoever it is, actually have come out to acknowledge that perhaps the only reason we're having this debate about climate change is because of Prince Charles, that he was decades ahead of anyone else about insisting that this is an important part of our global conversation, that it's a global conversation now because he led the way. And I think what he said in one of his speeches last couple of weeks was about the role of the royal family, or the role of the Prince of Wales, especially about bringing marginal issues into the centre ground so that they can be studied and debated. And I think with climate change, 100%, 110%, I think that's what we've seen with Prince Charles. I think he has acknowledged his role as king is different. He inherits Her Majesty's responsibilities of impartiality, and to give governments space to make policy decisions, which is slightly different to the role of the Crown Prince. But I think the fact that climate change and Prince Charles are so intertwined as issues, as people and as issues, that I really hope that he continues to lead us in this way.
Well, I was really going to raise as well, how difficult is that going to be when the Queen herself was very apolitical, not getting involved in any of, never publicly speaking to any political matters or issues like that, even though she spoke to the Commonwealth regularly, she spoke to some important issues regularly, but that's really very much tied to him. Do you think it's going to be difficult for him to separate the crown itself now from those opinions held?
I don't think the contrast between Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Charles was that of personality. It wasn't that Her Majesty personality meant that she was apolitical and Prince Charles's personality meant that he was bigger. I think it was the separate roles. That the monarch the sovereign monarch responsibility within the constitutional democracy is one thing. The role of the royal family more broadly is to actually encourage these conversations and to allow space for them. I'm not going to speak on behalf of His Majesty, but I expect that we will see a change in that he will inherit Her Majesty's responsibilities, and that he will encourage, therefore, his son Prince William to speak on the issues that Prince William believes are important. Let's encourage Prince William to do the same, because if Prince Charles was decades ahead on climate change, then let's hope Prince William is going to be decades ahead on whatever's coming next. But on the issue of climate change itself, I think it has its own momentum. I think Prince Charles is a global leader. Perhaps the way he does that might change. I don't know. But it is probably the most important issue globally. So whoever the leader is, or whoever we are as subjects or as citizens, we all have a responsibility to do everything we can on climate change.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah. And I was going to say, and looking at I was in Grand Bahama last week, and I love meeting the people of Grand Bahama. I think it's a fantastic place. But seeing the devastations in some areas still of Hurricane Dorian, the people in Florida and of Cuba enduring Hurricane Ian at the minute are very much on my heart. And I think we need to all ensure that these types of catastrophic events are less often and less severe, and that is going to come from us all taking the crisis of climate change seriously.
I'm just going to use the opportunity just to slide in a question, though, about the response. I know that from our own experience after Hurricane Dorian, the British Royal Navy was probably the first fleet that the people of Abaco saw, on the ground. In instances like this, what role does the British government and the Royal Navy play in assisting countries like ours and others who are going through these devastating times? And I know, particularly during the hurricane season, you all keep a very close eye on the Caribbean and what's happening here.
Yeah, 100%. So the Royal Navy has a 100-year role in the Caribbean, and that has changed over time, but it has still to this day here in hurricane seasons to support many of the overseas territories, such as Turks and Caicos or Cayman or etc. And so there's always a Royal Navy vessel near for that reason. But equally, for sovereign nations like the Bahamas, we're extremely keen to respond when our friends need help. And Hurricane Dorian was one of those moments. And I think for Hurricane Matthew and before then, I think the Royal Navy has been the first responder on all of those, and brought with it assets of, a ship is a complex thing, so it has assets for oil mechanics or aircon engineers or structural engineers. They all are there to service the ship. So when the ship arrives, if you have a hospital that's not functioning, many of the people on the ship know how to fix that. And then you have the muscle of the Royal Marines on board, and you have the helicopter able to do surveys and deliver water. And we could always do more, and we never did enough. None of us did enough. But I think the people of Abaco appreciated that Royal Navy support, particularly. And RFA Tide Force was here last week, same reason. HMS Wedway is in the region as well. Tide Force came to Grand Bahama and then was quickly redeployed because of Hurricane Fiona down to Turks and Caicos. HMS Medway has gone across to the Cayman Islands. I know the Canadian Navy has deployed up in because of Hurricane Fiona up in the North Atlantic as well. And the UK has a privilege because of our royal forces. Royal military forces are so fantastic. We have a privilege to deploy them wherever they go. And let's touch wood to make sure that there's not a hurricane that hits the Bahamas again. But if it is, then the UK and everyone else will do absolutely everything they can to respond.
That's important, because I think sometimes we may overlook the fact that even though we are sovereign, and we have been independent for so many years, that relationship still exists, not just in word but also in deed.
Indeed, exactly. The fact that so many of the Defence Force have trained at Dartmouth means that actually they understand the British system, and they've trained with British naval officers, and there's that mutual and personal friendship that comes there. And that's reflected on every level, at universities, in law, in in the media, so many Brits and Bahamians have worked together that there is a natural connection between us, not just historic, but in a modern sense as well. And the UK isn't everywhere all the time, but we are in the Caribbean, often on counter-proliferation operations or training with NATO or responding to the overseas territories. And if there's an asset, a ship or people or a helicopter that can support in a crisis, then it's our privilege to help.
And you're so true. I mean, in my own experience, I can tell you, for many years I worked along and benefited from the BBC. So you're quite right. We still benefit in many ways. It's time for our last break in the show. We will be back with more On the Record right after this.
Great.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
The drumbeat of footsteps.
And you see there scenes from the procession in London as Her Majesty's body was leaving, accompanied by the royal family from Westminster Abbey on that final procession through London. In the past few years, there have been quite a bit of murmurs within the Commonwealth about the idea of stepping away from the monarchy. We've seen countries like Barbados move to be a republic. The Queen, though, had a very special relationship with the Commonwealth. From a young princess, she toured or began a tour of Commonwealth countries, and she maintained that relationship throughout her reign, visiting many of them frequently. Even at the time of the death of her father, she was off on a tour of the Commonwealth. Do you think King Charles will continue to have that same close relationship with the Commonwealth, particularly when countries are already discussing the possibility of becoming republics and doing away with the monarchy as the head of state?
Do I think King Charles will have a close relationship
Yes.
with Commonwealth? Mm-hmm. Yes, I do.
Why? Why would that be so important to him, do you think?
I think for two reasons. One, because he has, as head of the Commonwealth, as head of that group of 56 countries of sovereign nations, he has a global responsibility to serve, and he has already inherited so many of Her Majesty's responsibilities for royal tours, and he will continue that, I'm certain, as long as he is able to. And I think that is hugely important, and that he sees his role as serving and as public service, and I think that is that will continue, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. For those that decide to maintain or retain the monarchy as head, what are the benefits of remaining with having a King Charles what are the benefits of keeping a king, now king, as your head of state as the monarchy?
I don't know if it's necessarily a debate of benefits of not of a monarchy. I think there's many countries in the world that have monarchies, and some of whom are the British monarchs or their own monarch, or some of them who are republics, and they each are different systems that best serves the citizens at the time. I think the fact that King Charles is the monarch of 15 countries, the Bahamas, the UK, Australia, Canada, on and on and on and on, I think binds those countries together. I think that is it is, if nothing else, it's an excuse to have a conversation between the Bahamas and the UK that because His Majesty is encouraged us to. Equally, staying part of the Commonwealth allows that as well. And but I think overall, it's what we spoke about earlier. Is about the benefits of a monarchy, per se, is that it's the stability. It is the long-term view, and I think the fact that the reason that so many of us felt so lost when Her Majesty died, is because she had provided that stability for us all. She was the great grandmother or the great godmother for who was the matriarch of our families, but matriarch of all our families. And it's a constitutional democracy that has a monarch at the top that is unique in that system. When you, in contrast to those countries that are republics and change their president every 5 years, again, I see the strength of one feeling connected to the president in that way, but it has a downside of not having the stability of over that long term. And then you have so much. I'm certain that whatever happens, if countries choose to become republics, these things won't be lost. But there is so much historic connection between countries as well. Whether, as you say, it's the Royal Bahamian Defence Force, the fact that they're the Royal Bahamian Defence Force, even the fact that they're training at Dartmouth connects them to the Royal Navy, and the fact that so many wonderful Bahamian families choose to send their children to boarding school in the UK or to university at British universities creates a common language and a common understanding. And these things will never be lost. These are historical strengths, and they will go from strength to strength. But they existed perhaps once upon a time because of the royal family, and I'm sure the royal family will continue to invent or to create the space for those things to evolve.
There was a time when the now king was not as popular with the British public, and even I would say with the world, following the separation and the untimely death of Princess Diana. Has the public moved on from that? I mean, he's remarried, there's now the Queen's consort. Has the public moved beyond that? Or is that still lingering? Do you see that as being a hurdle as a part of his reign?
I think, let me rephrase the question slightly and say, I think that all of us have a strong connection to King Charles, and I think we have, for us each, we have a lens through which we see him and the royal family. We talked about climate change earlier, and for me, growing up, I remember the first thing I remember was he was the person who spoke to plants and would go up and whisper to them, and because the importance of the carbon dioxide and photosynthesis and all those sort of things, and he taught me those things, and he was perhaps politely mocked in the press for those things, but it was an important way to kind of create that space. And we each have different bits of his history, of his personal life that we will all want to reflect on and comment on. I think we're seeing the same thing with the new generation of younger royals coming through. So many of us feel like we have a right to have an opinion on these things. And I think what my own reflection in is the humility on which we know that none of us are perfect. And whoever's without sin cast the first stone. And what I am proud of is that my leaders and the leaders of the Bahamas chose service first. And it was, I'm not sure when you were outside on the streets in Parliament if you heard the Archbishop of Canterbury's speech, but there was a beautiful paragraph in there that said, those leaders who commit themselves to serving will be remembered long after those leaders who've chosen personal privilege and position. It's a bad paraphrase, and the fact that Her Majesty and His Majesty chose service, I think that is a privilege to have that as our leaders and our monarch, and I wouldn't want anything else. As we were coming in, I saw under the royal logo it says God at my right, and I think we have seen so much of Her Majesty's Christian faith in her, and I think it is the same Christian faith in King Charles as well. We saw at the opening clip at the beginning that the first thing Her Majesty did when she was being crowned was say private prayer. That wasn't theatre, that wasn't drama, that was her personal commitment to put God first, and I actually don't know what she prayed. I don't know if any of us know what she prayed that time, but the fact that they all confess to have a personal faith is what leads them to be humble servants in the image of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. As as we're preparing to wrap up now on this particular show, we are really at a new era in the life of the monarchy. I think even Prince William and Kate represent something different that we have not seen, and represent a new generation. What do you think people are going to be, or how do you think people are now going to view the entire royal family after all of this? The Queen herself had been that glue, that eye, and that foundation. And we've seen, like so many other families, as we talked about very briefly, they've had their tribulations. They've had some of the real life experiences that we have, in our own lives and our own families. But how do you think now the world will reflect on all of this, particularly for the royal family? Because I always tell people, for me, they are my superstars. They're my celebrities. I grew up, watching this family on television in many instances. But how do you see now the royal family itself changing, and maybe how people see the royal family?
I think they'll set up for themselves their priorities, and for any family that's lost a mother or a grandmother, they will need time, and they'll want space to mourn and space to understand their own answers to that question. I think at least the media have reported that King Charles is thinking about a smaller, leaner royal family. So those who serve are a smaller group of royals, in order, I assume, to make them less costly and less burdensome on us all. And I think that's part of an understanding of the cost of living crisis that the world is going through at the minute, and therefore wanting to make sure that it's an appropriate level of size of royal family. I think for all of us, we will all go on a personal journey about what we want from our royal family, what we want from our monarchy. I never asked that question really for myself of what I wanted from Her Majesty. And instead, even without asking, I was given a gift of an answer, which is, how can I serve my country best? And at a guess, I think that's what we will have from King Charles, irrespective of what we all think. And irrespective of whether he asked the question or not, we will all see a king and a royal family who commits themselves to service in the model of Her Majesty. And
I think we could not ask for more.
No.
I think that's a very good way to end the show. Thank you so very much. We're out of time, sir. British High Commissioner, it was our pleasure hosting you tonight. We appreciate you joining us and hope to have you back on again sometime soon. All right, thank you very much. Be sure and join us again next week when we explore another exciting topic. We'll see you again soon.